Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into the story behind the Union Corse. That term we often hear connected to Corsican organized crime, especially during the mid-20th century.
Right, roughly the 1930s through the 1970s, give or take.
Exactly. Our main source for this exploration is the pretty comprehensive Union Corse Wikipedia page. It pulls together quite a range of research.
Yeah, academic papers, news articles, books. It's a good starting point.
It is. And our goal for you today is to really get a handle on the history, the activities, and the actual influence this organization or network had during its peak years.
Particularly in relation to the French Connection heroin trade. That's key.
Absolutely key. Now, the name itself, Union Corse, it kind of suggests a single unified body, doesn't it?
It does. Sounds very official, very structured.
But what we're going to find, I think, is that the reality was, well, a lot more complex and maybe more interesting, actually.
That's right. Think of Union Corse more as a label, a term covering a significant period of criminal activity involving individuals, groups, mainly with Corsican and Italian-French roots.
Okay.
And the central, as you said, is definitely the French Connection. That huge network trafficking heroin.
Stretching from Turkey.
Right, the opium fields there through the processing labs in southern France, Marseille primarily.
And then ending up on the streets in America.
Precisely. And there was that 1972 Time magazine article.
Yeah.
And it painted a picture, didn't it?
It did. It presented the Union Corse as this unified, very secretive syndicate, even compared it to the American Mafia's 5 families.
Which is quite a comparison. Suggests a similar level of structure and, well, secrecy.
Okay, let's really dig into that idea, the unified syndicate thing. Because, I mean, it sounds like a classic mob story, right?
It does.
But the situation on the ground, particularly in southern France, seems like it was maybe a bit more fluid, dynamic.
Dynamic is a good word.
Yeah.
Instead of one single organization, a hierarchy, what really existed was more like an intricate web.
Where?
Or some sources even say a galaxy of clans,
Yeah.
mainly Corsican, Italian, French clans.
Okay, so not one big family, but lots of smaller groups.
Exactly. And these groups weren't always working together. You know, their relationships change. Sometimes they'd cooperate if there was a good opportunity.
Makes sense.
But other times, intense rivalries. Even outright conflict if their interests clashed.
So typical underworld stuff in that sense.
Pretty much. But, and this is crucial, it's undeniable, these clans were a key part of the French Connection.
Right.
They were the ones, especially around Marseille, who were vital in supplying that growing American heroin market, particularly from the 50s up to the early 70s.
So essential players. But were they the ones calling all the shots? Our source material kind of hints maybe they were more like specialists within a bigger picture.
That's a really important distinction to make. Yes, they were indispensable to the French Connection handling the processing, the distribution side in France.
The hands-on stuff.
Right. But the sources do suggest they were generally less powerful than the established Italian-American Mafia families.
Okay.
Scholar Laurent Mucchielli actually argues their role was more like a local branch.
A local branch.
Yeah, or maybe commercial partners, even subcontractors, for the more powerful Cosa Nostra over in the U.S.
Interesting. So they're providing a crucial service, but maybe not setting the overall strategy.
That seems to be the consensus, yes.
Which leads us right into the French Connection itself. It sounds like the geography, Marseille, and Corsica's location was just absolutely critical.
Totally. Their spot in the Mediterranean, perfect.
Yeah.
Made them strategically vital transit points.
Especially during that key period, early 50s to early 70s.
Exactly. But the groundwork, that was laid even earlier. Back in the 1930s, you had these 2 figures in Marseille, Paul Carbone and François Spirito. Corsican and Italian mobsters, pretty dominant in the Marseille underworld then. They had already set up the initial ways to process opium, specifically for the U.S. market.
Wow. So they were pioneers in a way, ahead of the curve.
In that particular very dangerous business, yes.
And then later, Lucky Luciano and the Italian-American Mafia got more involved. I think our source mentioned their previous supply from Italy got cut off.
Exactly right. Their Italian pharmaceutical source got shut down around 1951. The Camorra had muscled in on it, apparently. So Luciano was key in structuring this new route, Turkey to Marseille to New York.
Okay, so he reorganized things.
He did. And the process itself was quite something. Morphine base from Turkish poppies smuggled by boat into Marseille.
Right.
And then the local chemists there, and these guys were reportedly really good.
Experts in their field, so to speak.
You could say that. They transformed it into exceptionally pure heroin. We're talking like 98% purity.
98%. That's incredible. It gives you an idea of the potency.
It really does.
And the sheer amount of heroin flowing through this pipeline, it's remarkable. The source says by the early 70s, something like 80% of U.S. heroin came via France.
That's the figure, yes.
Yeah.
And earlier, maybe early 60s, it might have been even higher, closer to 90%.
90%. That just highlights the scale, doesn't it? The efficiency of these networks, but also the huge demand in the U.S.
Absolutely. And, how hard it was initially to disrupt these routes.
Yeah. Those numbers really paint a picture of the impact the French Connection had on the American drug scene.
No question. Of course, eventually, this level of activity, it had to draw attention.
You think so?
And it did. Both French and American authorities eventually started cracking down, especially during Nixon's war on drugs, launched in '71.
Right.
And a key figure in France was Judge Pierre Michel. He was really digging into these networks.
And that didn't end well for him, did it?
No, tragically not. He was assassinated in Marseille in 1981. A stark reminder of just how dangerous this world was.
Absolutely. Really shows the stakes involved, the resistance they faced. Did his death change things much?
It certainly underscores the seriousness, but the dismantling was already underway by then, though it took time. It paints this picture of a really dangerous, complex criminal enterprise.
And circling back to what we said earlier, the Italo-Corsican clans, they weren't running the whole show from top to bottom.
Right.
They were managing the French end, right? Responding to, what was it, the phrase, calls for tender from the Sicilian Mafia in New York.
That's the description used, yes.
Yeah.
It really emphasizes that relationship. More like a specialized partnership, maybe, within that bigger structure.
Yeah.
And Mucchielli's point is key here. He sees them as the local operational arm, commercial partners, subcontractors even.
For the much bigger players.
For the considerably more powerful Italian-American Cosa Nostra, the big Sicilian mafia families in the States. The clans provided the local know-how, the infrastructure in France.
But the overall control, the reach.
Likely rested elsewhere, primarily with the American families.
Okay. Now let's dive a bit deeper into this whole structure and influence question, because that 1972 Time article, it painted such a specific picture.
It really did.
It mentioned about 15 specific Corsican families, my name Francisci, Orsini, Venturi, Guerini, loads of them, said they operated like the U.S. Mafia families, strong family ties.
Even a shared symbol, the Moor's head, remember?
Yeah.
Worn as a pendant or on a watch fob.
Right. So the popular image, fueled by things like that timepiece, is this highly organized, almost corporate entity.
Yeah, very neat and tidy in a criminal sort of way. That article definitely helped shape that perception, describing it as maybe even tighter, more secretive than the Sicilians, those family bonds creating this impenetrable wall.
But the consensus now among most observers, French and American, it seems to be that this was, well, a major oversimplification.
Very much, yes.
There wasn't this single top-down pyramidal Corsican mafia structure, no central committee deeply plugged into the French state.
Right. That image, that almost mythical Union Corse, it was powerful in the public mind. But why do you think that narrative stuck so hard, even if the reality was, messier?
That's a good question. I suppose the idea of a single secret enemy is always more compelling, isn't it? Easier to grasp.
Provides a clear villain, a sense of order maybe, even in chaos. But you have investigative journalists like Jacques Follerieux. He paints a very different picture. He calls it a galaxy of separate clans. Sometimes allies, sometimes enemies.
A galaxy. I like that image.
Yeah. And he argues they basically just exploited historical circumstances to get ahead. And sure, they had some relationships with political figures, administrative folks for protection.
But not necessarily deep infiltration at the top level.
Not systemic infiltration, no. More opportunistic, perhaps?
Right. Alliances of convenience, maybe, rather than some deeply embedded power structure pulling all the strings.
Exactly. And Mucchielli backs this up. He talks about a hierarchy based more on, authority and prestige.
Yeah.
And the principle of vendettas, always bubbling under the surface. He sees them as competing families, really only united by their Corsican background and the occasional joint deal when it made sense for everyone involved.
So, less like a boardroom, more like a marketplace for crime, where different groups team up when it suits them, but they're ultimately doing their own thing.
That feels closer to the descriptions we have, yes.
Yeah.
And, initially, Some Americans looked at the French government's slow response to the French connection.
And thought, aha, connections, corruption.
Right. They saw it maybe as evidence of links between the political elite and organized crime. But scholars offer other explanations.
Like what?
Well, for one, drug use in France itself was relatively low until the late 60s. It wasn't seen as a huge domestic problem initially.
Okay, different priorities.
Plus, France was pouring resources into the Algerian War until '62, and then there was the Gaullist Party's general attitude, kind of resistant to American interference in French affairs.
So a mix of domestic focus and maybe some political friction.
Plausibly, yes. It's a crucial reminder, isn't it? How international relations, domestic issues, they really shape how governments tackle problems like cross-border crime.
Definitely. And we should remember, cooperation did happen before the network was totally shut down, like the arrest of that chemist, Joe Cesari, back in '64.
That's a key point, yes. Collaboration did exist. And there's another fascinating angle some scholars raise. An even earlier potential connection, suggesting Italo-Corsican clans might have worked with Western European groups, maybe even including American elements, to break dock workers' strikes in Marseille.
Strikes. When was this?
Late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah.
Right in the thick of the Cold War, the idea being it was part of the West's strategy of containment against communist influence.
Wow. Okay, that connects local crime to huge geopolitical events. That's quite a theory.
It is. And it suggests the influence these groups had on local Marseille authorities might have actually peaked earlier, maybe in the 30s.
Before the big international heroin trade really took off.
Exactly. Researcher Paolo Manzini argues that as the trafficking became more international after WWII, the need for those deep local political roots in Marseille might have lessened. The focus shifted more to the logistics of moving drugs globally.
Okay, so the nature of their influence perhaps changed over time. It's really becoming clear, isn't it? The reality of the Union Corse is way more nuanced, less black and white than the pop culture image.
Absolutely. And speaking of pop culture, it's interesting how it pops up in fiction.
Yeah, it does. Ian Fleming used it, right? In James Bond.
That's right, on Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Yeah.
The Union Corse is led by this character, Mark Ange Draco. Adds that layer of exotic danger.
And Frederick Forsyth used it too in The Day of the Jackal. Keeps cementing that image of a shadowy Corsican underworld group.
And even in manga, for anyone who knows Banana Fish, the main bad guy, Dino Golzine, is head of the Union Corse there.
So it clearly captured the imagination.
Definitely has enduring fictional appeal.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Our deep dive into the Union Corse. What are the key takeaways? It wasn't really this single unified monolith that maybe Time magazine suggested.
No, much more a network, a collection of Corsican and Italian-French clans.
Clans who were absolutely vital to the French connection heroin trade, especially in that mid-20th century period.
Critical players, yes. But their relationship with the American Mafia seems more like partners or even subcontractors within a bigger international operation.
Right, and their influence on French authorities.
Right.
That's complex, subject to debate, maybe peaked earlier, likely more opportunistic than deeply systemic.
That seems a fair summary. And the pop culture portrayal, while entertaining, definitely simplifies a much more intricate reality.
It usually does.
Exactly. And this kind of leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about all these different views, the unified syndicate idea versus the fragmented network, what does this tell us about how hard it is to actually understand and define organized crime?
Especially when you look at it through different lenses, right? Law enforcement sees it one way, the media another, academics maybe differently again.
And fiction gives us yet another version, across different cultures too. And maybe think about the lasting impact of that whole French connection story. How has that narrative shaped how we still think about international drug trafficking today, its structures, its complexities? Something to ponder.